A Crow scout named Gray Hawk agreed to lead soldiers into land he swore never to betray. The promise he carried was older than the uniform he wore, and by the time he understood what the mission truly was, it was already too late to turn back. If you're ready for a story about loyalty, survival, and the harshest choice a man can face, hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment below, tell us where you're watching from. Now let's begin. The fort at the edge of Montana Territory smelled like horse sweat and rifle oil. Gray Hawk stood near the stables, checking the tension in his saddle straps. He had been called in 3 days earlier. The officer who hired him spoke in clipped sentences and avoided eye contact. That alone should have been a warning. But Gray Hawk needed the pay. His sister's family was 2 weeks north, and winter was coming early. The food they had stored would not last. So when the officer said the job was simple, guide a patrol into the lowlands and back within a week, Gray Hawk agreed. He did not ask what they were looking for. He had learned years ago that officers rarely told the truth anyway. The patrol left at dawn. 12 soldiers, 1 lieutenant, and Gray Hawk at the front. They rode in a loose column through dry grass that cracked under the horses' hooves. The sky was pale and cloudless. No one spoke much. The soldiers were young, most of them new to the frontier. They carried their rifles across their laps and watched the horizon like it might open up and swallow them. Gray Hawk rode ahead, reading the land. He had grown up in this region. Every ridge and water source was familiar to him. His father had taught him to track elk here when he was still small enough to ride double. His mother had gathered roots near the creek beds. And his younger sister had married a man from a camp 20 miles east, where families still lived the old way, away from forts and government rations. That was where the promise began. 5 years ago, after their mother died, Gray Hawk's sister asked him for one thing. She did not ask him to stay. She did not ask him to stop working for the army. She only asked him to keep their people's location quiet, to never guide soldiers near their camp, to protect them the way their father would have. Gray Hawk agreed. He gave his word in the old language, the way promises were meant to be kept. And for 5 years, he had honored it. He took jobs that led patrols away from that land. He steered officers toward empty valleys and abandoned sites. He became valuable because he always brought soldiers back safely, and they never questioned the routes he chose. But this mission felt different. The lieutenant riding behind him was named Corbett. He was older than the others, maybe 40, with a scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone. He did not speak to Gray Hawk directly. Instead, he gave orders to a corporal, who then relayed them forward. It was a small insult, but Gray Hawk had learned not to react. He kept his eyes on the trail and let the silence sit. By midday, they reached the first landmark, a dry riverbed that cut through the valley like a scar. Gray Hawk dismounted and crouched near the edge, running his fingers through the dust. There were no fresh tracks, no signs of movement. But something about the place felt wrong. He stood and scanned the ridgeline. The patrol waited behind him, horses shifting in the heat. Gray Hawk signaled for them to continue, and they moved on. That night, they made camp in a shallow basin, surrounded by low hills. The soldiers built a small fire and ate hardtack in silence. Gray Hawk sat apart from them, chewing dried meat and watching the stars. He thought about his sister, about her children, about the promise he had made. He told himself the mission would stay simple. They would finish the patrol, turn back, and he would collect his pay. Nothing would change. But deep down, he already knew that was a lie. The next morning, Lieutenant Corbett called Gray Hawk over. The officer stood near a map spread across a flat rock, his finger tracing a route that led east. Gray Hawk looked at the line and felt his chest tighten. It was heading directly toward his sister's camp. Corbett did not look up. He tapped the map twice and said the corporal would explain the rest. Then he walked away. The corporal was a narrow-faced man with a nervous habit of licking his lips. He glanced at Gray Hawk and gestured toward the map. The orders were clear. They were to scout a settlement reported near the eastern hills. Verify the location. Count the number of people. Report back. Gray Hawk stared at the map. He did not ask why. He did not ask what would happen after the report. He already knew. He folded the map and handed it back. Then he mounted his horse and led the patrol east. The land changed as they rode. The grass grew thicker. The hills became steeper. Gray Hawk recognized every turn. He had walked this path as a child. He had hunted here. He had said goodbye to his sister here. And now he was leading soldiers directly to her. He considered turning the patrol around. He could claim the map was wrong. He could say the settlement had moved. But Corbett was not a fool. The officer had chosen this route for a reason, and if Gray Hawk refused, they would find someone else. Someone who did not care about promises. So he kept riding. By the afternoon of the third day, they reached a ridge overlooking a shallow valley. Gray Hawk stopped his horse and dismounted. Below, tucked against a line of cottonwood trees, was the camp. It was smaller than he remembered. Maybe 15 lodges, smoke rose from a few cooking fires. Children played near the water. Women worked on hides stretched across wooden frames. It looked peaceful, ordinary, unaware. Gray Hawk stood at the edge of the ridge, staring down at the place his sister called home. He could see her lodge from where he stood. The one with the red stripe painted near the entrance. She had done that herself, using clay from the riverbank. Behind him, the soldiers dismounted. Corbett walked forward and stood beside Gray Hawk, studying the camp through a brass scope. He did not say anything, he just looked. Then he closed the scope and nodded. The corporal pulled out a notebook and began writing. Gray Hawk watched him count the lodges. Estimate the number of people, mark the location on the map. And then Corbett gave the next order. They were not turning back. They were moving closer. The patrol descended the ridge slowly, staying below the sight line. Corbett wanted a closer view. He wanted to confirm the count. He wanted to see if there were weapons, if there were men of fighting age, if there was any reason to classify the camp as hostile. Gray Hawk led them down a narrow trail that wound through scrub brush and stone. His hands were steady on the reins, but his mind was racing. He thought about warning the camp, about riding ahead and telling his sister to leave. But there was no time, and even if he tried, the soldiers would see. They would know. And then the promise would not matter anyway. They stopped a quarter-mile from the camp, hidden behind a low rise. Corbett ordered the men to stay quiet, no fires, no movement. They would watch through the evening and leave at first light. Gray Hawk sat with his back against a boulder, staring at the ground. He could hear the faint sounds of the camp carried on the wind. Children laughing, a dog barking, the rhythmic thud of someone chopping wood. He thought about his mother's funeral, about the way his sister had held his hand and asked him to protect her, about the way he had said yes without hesitation, because that was what family did. But now, sitting in the dirt with soldiers at his back and his sister's home in front of him, he realized how fragile that promise had always been. The sun set slowly. The camp settled into evening routines. Fires dimmed. Voices faded. And Gray Hawk sat in the dark, knowing that tomorrow everything would change. Just before dawn, something happened that Gray Hawk did not expect. A young soldier barely 19, with a soft face and shaking hands, stood up from his bedroll and walked toward the edge of the rise. He was not supposed to move. Corbett had made that clear, but the boy was new, nervous, and he made a mistake. He kicked a loose stone. It tumbled down the slope, clattering against rocks as it fell. The sound was sharp in the stillness. And in the camp below, a dog started barking. Corbett was on his feet in seconds, his hand on his revolver. The other soldiers scrambled up, grabbing their rifles. Gray Hawk stood slowly, his heart pounding. The camp was waking. Voices rose. Figures moved between the lodges. And then, a man stepped out into the open, holding a rifle. He was older, maybe 50, with gray streaks in his long hair. He scanned the hills, searching for the source of the noise. Corbett cursed under his breath. He turned to the corporal and gave a sharp order. The soldiers spread out along the rise, rifles ready. Gray Hawk stepped forward. He moved carefully, keeping his hands visible. He looked at Corbett and shook his head. There was no need for this. The camp was not a threat. They could leave. They could go back to the fort and report what they had seen, and nothing more would happen. But Corbett did not move. He stared down at the camp, his jaw tight, his hand still on his gun. And then the man below raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked across the valley like a whip. And in that instant, everything broke. Corbett shouted an order. The soldiers opened fire. The air filled with the thunder of rifles and the screams of people below. Gray Hawk lunged forward, grabbing Corbett's arm, trying to pull him back. But the officer shoved him away, hard enough that Gray Hawk stumbled. He hit the ground and rolled, his chest tight with panic. Below, the camp was chaos. People were running, falling, trying to reach the trees, trying to shield their children. Gray Hawk saw his sister. She was carrying a small child, her youngest, and running toward the water. Her face was twisted with fear. She did not see him. She did not know he was there. And then a bullet struck her in the back. She fell forward, still holding the child. The boy tumbled free and crawled toward her, crying. Gray Hawk could hear the sound even over the gunfire. A thin, broken wail that cut through everything else. He tried to stand, tried to move. But one of the soldiers grabbed him and pinned him down, holding him in place while the shooting continued. It lasted less than 3 minutes. But when it was over, the camp was silent. Corbett ordered the men to move in. They walked through the camp carefully, rifles raised, checking each lodge. Most of the people were dead. A few had made it to the trees, but they were gone now, scattered into the wilderness. Gray Hawk walked through the camp like a ghost. His legs moved, but he did not feel them. He passed bodies he recognized, faces he had known. A woman who used to trade beads with his mother. A boy who had raced him on horseback years ago. And then he reached his sister. She was lying face down near the water, one arm stretched out toward her son. The boy was huddled against her, unmoving, his small body curled tight. Gray Hawk knelt beside them. He did not touch her. He just stared, his hands open at his sides. He had broken the promise, not by choice, not by intention, but it was broken all the same. Behind him, Corbett was shouting orders. The soldiers were gathering supplies, anything useful, anything they could carry. They moved through the camp like scavengers, indifferent to the bodies around them. Gray Hawk stood slowly. He turned and walked back toward the rise where the horses waited. His mind was empty. His chest felt hollow. And then, as he reached the edge of the camp, he saw something that stopped him cold. One of the soldiers was holding a piece of paper. He handed it to Corbett, who read it quickly and then folded it into his coat. Gray Hawk recognized the handwriting. It was from the fort, orders, dated 2 weeks before the patrol left. And suddenly he understood. The patrol did not return to the fort that day. Instead, Corbett led them west, deeper into the hills. Gray Hawk followed, numb and silent. He did not ask where they were going. He did not care. They made camp that night in a narrow canyon. The soldiers were quiet, uneasy. A few of them avoided looking at Gray Hawk. Others watched him closely, like they expected him to run. Gray Hawk sat by himself, staring at the fire. He thought about the piece of paper, about the orders, about the way Corbett had folded it so carefully, like it was evidence he needed to protect. And then, in the dark, he heard 2 soldiers talking. They were sitting on the far side of the camp, their voices low. But the canyon carried sound well, and Gray Hawk's hearing was sharp. One of them said the patrol was never supposed to go back the way they came. Corbett had a second route planned. A longer one, through land that was harder to track. Land where a body would not be found for months. The other soldier laughed nervously and said something about loose ends. about how scouts were useful until they were not, about how the army did not like witnesses who might talk. Gray Hawk's hands curled into fists. He looked across the camp at Corbett, who was sitting near the fire, cleaning his revolver. The officer glanced up. Their eyes met. And Corbett smiled. It was a cold, deliberate smile. The kind that said he knew exactly what Gray Hawk had just figured out. The mission had never been about scouting. It had been about elimination. The camp, the witnesses, and Gray Hawk himself. He was never meant to return alive. Gray Hawk did not sleep that night. He sat with his back against the canyon wall, watching the soldiers, watching Corbett, counting the ways he could die. He thought about running, but they would hear him. And even if he made it out of the canyon, they would track him. Corbett would send men, and they would find him, so he waited. The next morning, the patrol moved again. They rode through rough terrain, climbing higher into the mountains. The air grew colder. The horses struggled on the steep paths. And Gray Hawk began to notice something. Corbett was positioning him at the front again. But this time, the soldiers were spreading out behind him. Keeping distance, keeping their rifles loose, they were preparing. By midday, they reached a narrow pass between two high cliffs. The trail was barely wide enough for one horse. Gray Hawk rode through first, his eyes scanning the rocks above. And then he heard it. The metallic click of a rifle being cocked. He turned in the saddle just as the first shot rang out. The bullet missed him by inches, striking the rock beside his head. Gray Hawk kicked his horse forward, hard, and the animal surged ahead. Behind him, more shots followed. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, deafening and chaotic. Gray Hawk leaned low over his horse's neck, urging it faster. The trail twisted sharply to the left, and he took the turn without slowing. His horse stumbled but recovered, hooves skidding on loose stone. Behind him, the soldiers were shouting. Corbett's voice rose above the others, barking orders. Gray Hawk did not look back. He focused on the path ahead, on the narrow strip of dirt that led deeper into the mountains. The shooting stopped. The soldiers could not follow at full speed through the pass. But Gray Hawk knew they would come. Corbett would not stop now. He rode for hours, pushing his horse to the edge of exhaustion. The trail climbed higher, winding through pine forests and open ridges. By evening, he reached a plateau overlooking a wide valley. He dismounted and led his horse into a thick stand of trees, where they would be hidden from the trail below. Then he waited. The soldiers arrived 2 hours after sunset. Gray Hawk heard them before he saw them, the sound of hooves on stone, the low murmur of voices. He counted 8 men. Corbett was with them, riding at the front. They stopped at the edge of the plateau, spreading out to search. Gray Hawk stayed perfectly still, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. He had no gun, no rifle. Just the blade and the knowledge that if found him, he would not survive. One of the soldiers walked within 10 feet of where Gray Hawk was hidden. The man paused, scanning the trees, his rifle raised. Gray Hawk held his breath. And then the soldier moved on. Corbett called the men back. They regrouped at the center of the plateau, and Gray Hawk could hear the officer's voice clearly now. He was angry, frustrated. He wanted Gray Hawk found before dawn. They split into pairs and moved in different directions. Gray Hawk waited until they were far enough apart, and then he moved. He slipped through the trees, circling behind the patrol. His movements were silent, learned from a lifetime of tracking game. He reached the edge of the plateau and looked down at the trail below. The soldiers' horses were tied there, unguarded. Gray Hawk climbed down carefully, using roots and rocks for handholds. When he reached the bottom, he moved quickly. He cut the reins on 3 of the horses and slapped their flanks, sending them scattering into the darkness. Then he took one of the remaining horses, a strong roan with steady eyes, and mounted. He rode south, away from the patrol, away from the fort, toward land he had not seen in years, toward the only place he could think to go. Gray Hawk rode through the night and into the next day. He did not stop except to let the horse drink. His body ached. His hands were blistered from gripping the reins. But he kept moving. By the second evening, he reached a valley he recognized. It was far to the south, near the edge of Crow territory. There was a small camp here, distant relatives, people who had known his father, people who might help. But when he arrived, the camp was gone. The lodges were burned, the ground was scorched. And in the center of it all, a wooden post had been driven into the earth. Nailed to the post was a piece of cloth with words painted in crude letters. Hostiles removed. Gray Hawk dismounted and walked through the remains. He found no bodies. They had either been taken or had fled. But the message was clear. The army was cleaning the frontier, camp by camp, family by family, and Gray Hawk had been part of it. He sank to his knees in the ash, his hands pressed against the ground. He thought about his sister, about his mother, about the promise he had made and the life he had chosen. And he realized something. He could not run forever. Corbett would keep coming. The army would keep coming. Because as long as Gray Hawk was alive, he was a witness, a loose end, a reminder of what they had done. But he did not want to die alone, not out here, not in the dirt. So he made a choice. Gray Hawk rode back north. Not toward the fort, not toward safety, but toward the one place he knew Corbett would eventually go. The lowlands near his sister's destroyed camp. The place where it all began. He arrived 3 days later, exhausted and half-starved. He found a high ridge overlooking the valley and built a small shelter from branches and stone. Then he waited. He did not have to wait long. On the 4th day, he saw them. Corbett and 6 soldiers riding through the valley below. They moved slowly, cautiously, scanning the hills. They were hunting him. Gray Hawk watched them from above. He counted their rifles, their supplies, their movements. And then he began to plan. He spent the next 2 days preparing. He gathered stones and piled them along the ridge. He found dry branches and stacked them in narrow gaps between rocks. He dug shallow trenches and covered them with loose dirt. He turned the ridge into a trap. On the evening of the 2nd day, Corbett's patrol camped at the base of the ridge. They built a fire and set up watch rotations. Gray Hawk could see them clearly from above. He could hear their voices. He could see Corbett sitting near the fire, staring up at the hills like he knew Gray Hawk was there. And maybe he did. Just after midnight, Gray Hawk lit the first fire. The dry branches caught quickly, and flames spread along the ridge, illuminating the rocks above. The soldiers below scrambled to their feet, shouting and grabbing their rifles. Corbett pointed up at the ridge, and the men started climbing. Gray Hawk waited until they were halfway up. Then he pushed the first pile of stones. The rocks tumbled down the slope, crashing into the climbers. One soldier fell, screaming. Another was struck in the shoulder and dropped his rifle. The rest kept coming. Gray Hawk moved along the ridge, lighting more fires, pushing more stones. He moved like a shadow, using the terrain he knew better than anyone. The soldiers fired blindly into the darkness, their bullets striking rock and dirt, but missing him. One by one, they fell back, injured, exhausted, afraid. By dawn, only Corbett remained. Corbett climbed the ridge alone. He moved slowly, deliberately, his rifle slung across his back. He did not shout. He did not call out, he just climbed. Gray Hawk watched him from behind a boulder. He held his knife in one hand, the blade dark with rust and ash. He was tired, wounded, bleeding from a graze across his ribs. But he was still standing. Corbett reached the top of the ridge and stopped. He looked around, scanning the rocks. And then he spoke. He said he respected what Gray Hawk had done, that it took courage, that it took skill, but he also said it was over. That Gray Hawk could not win, that the army would send more men, that the frontier would be cleared, one way or another. He said Gray Hawk was just delaying the inevitable. Gray Hawk stepped out from behind the boulder. He stood in the open, his knife at his side. He looked at Corbett, and for the first time in days, he felt something other than fear. He felt clarity. Corbett drew his revolver. Greyhawk did not move. The two men stood facing each other in the pale morning light, the valley silent below them. And then Corbett fired. The bullet struck Greyhawk in the chest, just below the collarbone. He staggered, but did not fall. He took one step forward, then another. His hand tightened around the knife. Corbett fired again. This time, the bullet hit Greyhawk's side. He gasped, his legs buckling, but he kept moving. He closed the distance between them. 5 feet, 3, 1, and then he drove the knife into Corbett's chest. The officer's eyes went wide. His revolver slipped from his hand and clattered against the rocks. Greyhawk held the knife in place, his face inches from Corbett's, his breath ragged and wet. Corbett's knees gave out, and he collapsed. Greyhawk fell with him, still holding the blade. They lay there together on the ridge, bleeding into the dirt. Greyhawk did not know how long he lay there. Minutes, hours. The sun rose higher, warming the rocks. The wind carried the smell of smoke and blood. He thought about his sister, about the boy she had been carrying, about the promise he had made and the way it had shattered. He thought about his mother and the way she used to sing in the evenings, about his father, who had taught him to track by watching the way animals moved through the grass. He thought about the life he could have had, the life he should have had. And then he closed his eyes. When the soldiers from the fort finally found the ridge, they found 2 bodies. One was Lieutenant Corbett, a knife still buried in his chest. The other was Greyhawk, lying a few feet away, his hand outstretched toward the valley below. They buried Corbett with military honors. They left Greyhawk where he fell. Years later, a Crow elder told a story about a scout who had guided soldiers into his homeland and paid for it with his life. The elder said the scout had tried to warn his people, but the warning came too late. He said the scout had fought at the end, not for glory, but for something older, something that could not be taken by bullets or orders. The elder said the scout had kept his promise, even when the world made it impossible. And that, in the end, was the only thing that mattered. Not all promises can be kept, but some are worth dying for anyway.